I bumped into this guy, Colonel Pham Van Den, as I was, and oops, I'm already giving away the story here because you'll see him in two different uniforms. Well, one thing I kind of realized that I had to include in a course on the Vietnam War was like the Vietnamese. It might seem like a natural thing to do. And usually when Americans think about Vietnamese in the Vietnam War, they think about the guy with the red, the second picture, the North Vietnamese. Well, I was bright enough to know after having taught a couple classes that there were South Vietnamese too, guys who fought on our side. So maybe I ought to include them. And he was a speaker. He was the one guy brave enough to come talk about his experience in the South Vietnamese Army. That's not something you're supposed to talk about in the great state of Vietnam today, as South Vietnamese Army. But he was brave enough because he'd become that. He came and talked to our group about a battle he had fought in. And then after he bonded with them a little bit, said, let's all hop on the bus. Let's go to another battlefield. And he took us to another battlefield, a place where he fought in 1972 that we'll show you a little bit more on a map later. But he took us to a crumbling edifice, a crumbling monument. And I said, what's that monument? He said, that's the monument to where I surrendered my entire regiment and changed sides. And then I was like, wow, this is, and by the way, he was perhaps the South Vietnamese hero. He holds 2 U.S. Silver Stars. In the book, he only let me mention 1 Bronze Star because he was being modest. 2 U.S. Silver Stars, which is the highest award we can give a foreign combatant, an ally. He holds 2 of them. He was a big hero. But yet, in 1972, he changed sides. Boy, I had to write a book about this guy. And he asked me. He literally stuck out his hand and said, do you want to write a book about me? I said, sure. Thanks for that. Thanks for that. Because this is not what heroes are supposed to do. This is not the way wars are supposed to unfold. That heroes change sides. I mean, come on. I was just at the Alamo. Davy Crockett's a hero, right? That's the way heroes are supposed to face up against intolerable odds, is fight on to the end. So I tried everything I could to research about him. And one of the amazing things, and kind of a side issue to this whole deal, is that one of the great ways to South Vietnam's archives don't exist because South Vietnam doesn't exist. It's kind of hard to get to them. In researching anything South Vietnamese, go look at American records because every South Vietnamese unit had American advisors, and lots of them. That's how I was able to get to him, was through his American advisors. Of course, talking to him, he's a major source, but his American advisors as well. All of his American advisors said, well, if you're going to write a book about this guy, you need to include this guy, Tran Ngoc Huê, who was Pham Van Den's kind of military protege. This guy also holds a U.S. Silver Star from the same battle that Pham Van Den won, one of his. He was a little bit behind him. He was 3 or 4 years behind him, depending on how you look at it, in the military ranks. And pretty much when Den left the unit, Huê took it over. He was literally his military protege. He fought on to the end. His unit was surrounded and destroyed in Laos, in the invasion of Laos in 1971. And when I mean destroyed, he was a battalion commander, and a Vietnamese battalion probably numbered 500 folks around this time. 26 of them survived. So it was destroyed. He was almost mortally wounded with his unit. They carried him back up the Ho Chi Minh Trail to Hanoi to put him in prison. A long way up the Ho Chi Minh Trail. On the way, they had no medicine to give him, so his wounds were infected by various parasites and whatnot that ate off his fingers. His hand was gone when he got there. And then they proceeded to throw him into prison for 13 years. He eventually got out of prison, was put under house arrest in Saigon for a further 6 years. If you're a member of the South Vietnamese military, yeah, when you get out of your re-education camps, life doesn't get any better. You're not allowed to have a job. You're expunged from society. This picture, oddly enough, was carried by his last U.S. advisor. U.S. advisors were not allowed into Laos with the South Vietnamese units when they went in 1971. His last U.S. advisor, Colonel David Wiseman, had to listen on the radio while he heard his friend assumingly be killed and while he heard the unit be destroyed. But he never gave up, though he had no reason to hope that Tran Ngoc Huê, who goes by Harry, was alive. He had a picture made of him, which in Vietnamese basically says, do you know this guy? Please call me. He showed this picture around for 20 years until he finally showed it to a cousin of Harry's who had come over in the wave of the boat people. So yeah, he's alive. He's under house arrest in Saigon. Harry's ex-advisors got together, raised the money for him and his whole family to come to the United States, which they did in 1991. And he's now the model of an American patriotic middle-class citizen, though he came here with nothing, with zero, with just the bare basis of being able to speak the language. So what I went to Vietnam for, very obviously, was to find out more about the war of my generation. What I stumbled across was a Vietnamese war that not too many Americans are real cognizant of. And so I wanted to write a book about these fellows. And man, this is unnerving, but I'm going to keep on talking this way. I had to write a book about these guys, okay? The traitor, and as we'll see, tortured traitor, and the hero. And they were brothers. These guys were friends, and they were heroes. And how, in the end of their military experience, did one go one way and one go the other? I had a way to look at Vietnam War as a whole. So I came home from this trip, and first thing I had to do was retool everything. This is my academic midlife crisis, I like to call it, and kind of learn everything there was to know about the South Vietnamese military. And happily, that took about 5 minutes because nobody writes on it. The image of the South Vietnamese military is pretty simple. They were awful, period. And that's all there is to it. So it didn't take me long to figure out that there's more to the story than that. I'd already found out there was more to the story. These guys, and listen to this, these guys, Pham Van Dien, the guy who surrendered, joined the South Vietnamese military in 1961, surrendered in 1972, and then was in the North Vietnamese, or later Vietnamese military, until 2005. That's a long experience through which to view the entire war. Harry Hue was in the South Vietnamese military from 63 to 71 when he was captured, then, of course, lived that other life, the life of prison. But through the eyes of these fellows, I was able to look at the entire war, from the beginning of it, actually up to today. Is there a main point in the whole? Well, I guess that's it. Is there a main point in the book? Main point is our policy then and our history today to American in focus. Pretty simple. Our policy then and our history today to American in focus. If my students ever call you, don't tell them this next part, because this is their final exam question. Was the Vietnam War winnable? The answer is yes. There's a very traditional answer to that a lot of historians have kind of veered off to now. Yeah, it was simple. We should have invaded North Vietnam. We should have cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail into Laos. We should have done more of the same, but bigger. Well, I think that's a counterproductive argument because Lyndon Johnson was not going to do that, period. So to go back in history and say he should have done something else, I think is a little counterproductive. That was not in the cards. I think the way to have won it was for these guys to have won it. For that war to have been sustainable. Again, the one thing that probably everybody knows about the Vietnam War is that we won all the battles, but somehow we lost the war. Tactically, we won it, but strategically unsustainable. Does that make sense? Even though we won all the battles, there was nothing there to sustain those ongoing victories. To be honest with you, South Vietnam had to be both worthy of its own survival and capable of its own survival. Without that, our troops would still be there, winning tactical victories, if they couldn't make those victories sustainable. So here's, I think, the biggest point. The South Vietnamese should be central to the focus of history on the Vietnam War. That's where the war could have been won, where our fantastic military and their culture crossed. That's where things could have happened. And understanding the South Vietnamese and their military and its failures, I think, make understanding the Vietnam War a lot more clear. Man, I'm going slow. Look how fast that clock is going. Conclusions from the book. First off, I think it's inappropriate to contend that the South Vietnamese military is just a bunch of cowards, just a failure. I will throw just a couple of things at you to hopefully back that up, and I'll just press another slide here. We'll keep on going. This is just some ARVN soldiers and one of their Australian advisors in this case. Look at the South Vietnamese military experience. South Vietnamese military fought the Vietnam War from 1954 to 1975. South Vietnam was at war every day of its existence. That's a nation that was willing to fight. South Vietnam lost 200,000 military battle deaths. If you put that in proportion to our population, that would have been 6 million American dead.